would like to thank you all for coming in today and would like to welcome you to this seminar, Australia and China, the Changing Market Dynamics and the Future Opportunities seminar. It's not starting shortly, it is actually just commenced. It's on behalf of Australian Grape and Wine. So the reason we're holding this seminar is that the recent decisions on China have meant that there's a lot of uncertainty out there in the sector about the way forward. So we would like to update you on what's been happening, so where we're up to, what's going to happen next, and some of the activities that are taking place. My name is Tony Battleine. I'm Chief Executive of Australian Grape and Wine, the national peak representative body for the sector. We're very lucky to have four great speakers here today. The first speaker will be Damien Graffanti. He is the Manager of Policy and Market Access from Australian Grape and Wine. He will speak briefly on some of the market diversification opportunities that are open to the sector and some of the work we're doing to do that. Then we've got Dr. Eric Wilkes, who's the Group Manager from the Commercial Services at the Australian Wine Research Institute. He's going to talk about the Australian wine technical capabilities. Eric is, and I'll introduce all these speakers to you a little later. Then there's Steve Guy, Technical Advisor to Australian Grape and Wine, and obviously known to many of you as a former member of Australian Wine and Brandy Corporation, Australian Wine and Grape Authority, and Wine Australia. He's very old, but he should be able to make it through the session. And then, of course, we're very lucky to have Rachel Triggs, who's the General Manager of Corporate Affairs and Regulation from Wine Australia. What we'll do is we'll have a number of short presentations, then we'll open up for questions after all the speakers, so we'll coordinate questions on behalf. There's also drinks following this, and so all the speakers will be around, and I would encourage you, if you have questions that you either don't think of during this time or wish to ask in private, then please buttonhole any one of the speakers, or indeed anyone else in the audience. So I'm going to just kick off very briefly and talk about some of the current status of what's happened with China, a little bit of lead up. It's pretty clear to all of you that 2020 was a pretty tough year. This photo, it's the Henschke Vineyard up at Lenswood. It got hammered by fire. You can see the fire scar through there. That augured in 2020. It seemed like nothing could get much worse, and then we had COVID, and then we had China, and all those things made for what was a pretty intensive and difficult year. Coupled with that, we had a vintage which was pretty small. So we've had a lot of people who were very worried about the future back then. I'm afraid it hasn't got much simpler. So I'll talk to you a little bit about China. So the issues with China have been going on for some time. This is not a recent event. So we've had problems between the Chinese government and the Australian government. There's been political tensions for a number of years. If you remember back to 2018, there were a number of shipments held up at the border for quite some time. And then since then, we've had considerable, I guess, distrust arising between the countries. We had the anti-dumping and countervailing duties investigations launched back in, it would have been around August. Then we had, of course, in October, there was an informal announcement that the borders would be closed, there'd be difficult borders. And since then, we've had the final determinations that were made by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce on the 26th of March. You don't all know these. Essentially, they effectively up to 218.4%. The countervailing duties are not on top of the anti-dumping duties, so the worst possible option you've got is 218.4%. That makes it pretty clear that the exports of bottled still wine into China become unviable for nearly all producers. The duties are put on for 5 years from the 28th of March, and as I say, effectively closes the markets. Since the announcement of the duties, we've been talking very, very closely with the Australian Government, Department of Foreign Affairs, the Minister for Trade, Dan Tehan, and others about what the possible options are. These are the options. There's bilateral consultations. There's the possibility of domestic administrative review in China, domestic judicial court action in China, dispute action under our free trade agreement, WTO committee processes, changed circumstances review, and the WTO dispute action. I'll talk a little bit about these, but there's, from these group of 7, there's probably only 3 that are worthy of consideration. First of these is bilateral considerations. Obviously, it'd be great if we could sit down, government to government, and talk to our Chinese counterparts and try and resolve the situation. The reality is that's not going to happen. So Dan Tehan wrote to his counterpart as soon as he took over the Trade Minister's role, seeking a meeting. He's had no response to date. Our officials at the Chinese Embassy in Beijing, they have had virtually no communication with counterparts in China since 2018. So in essence, there's very little bilateral consultations going on. Domestic administrative review in China, the barley industry went down that route. It was unsuccessful for us. It seems like very unlikely for success, and it's not an option we'll pursue. Court action, similarly, is not an option that is viable or would have a chance of success. Dispute action under chapter, there's no real ability to do that under that wine agreement. So again, that's not an option we'll take. The WTO committee processes are interesting. So under the World Trade Organization, you have a number of committees that deal with dumping and countervailing duties. They met a couple of weeks ago, last week it was, where they talked about both this and the barley case. There were quite good and positive discussions between the Chinese and Australian officials at these meetings, because you get meetings at these fora, these multilateral forums, but it was pretty clear that the Chinese believe that what they have done is legal and justified, and there's no possibility of them changing that position bilaterally. The changed circumstances review, that is something that can only be looked at within a year, so it can't be done at this stage, and that will look at if something has changed during the time so that either dumping or subsidies not seen as a problem. And the World Trade Organization dispute action. I'll just spend a minute or two on WTO disputes. We've just had a successful dispute action against Canada, where we've taken them on because of some discriminatory activities they have in favour of domestic product. And that's been very successful in getting that changed. WTO dispute action is not an aggressive form of action. It's actually set down under World Trade Organization rules, which indeed is what dumping and countervailing duties are. So they are set under the World Trade Organization rules, and WTO dispute action is a natural course of action to take in response. The government is currently considering its position and the legal case around this. And they're consulting with other industries to see what their views are. And we expect the government to make a decision on that within the next 3 or 4 weeks. I believe that everyone should understand that even if we do WTO dispute action, it doesn't solve this issue. What it does do, it takes 3 to 4 years to conclusion. But what it does do is give you an off-ramp. So if relationships can improve on a bilateral sense, and if we can get a better relationship between governments, it gives a chance during these proceedings to actually come to and drop the current situation or reduce it. So it gives you that off-ramp. So it's quite good from that respect. But certainly in the short term, I do not see any prospect of the situation with China improving. And that means that bilateral relations, and if you read the news today, you'll see they've only just got worse again. So that there's no chance, so that market will remain closed. That means 120 to 130 million litres of wine requires a home every year. So the other options that we have, if we can't resolve the problem, are look what can we do? And they're either diversification of product or production. Obviously, in China, bulk wine, non-alcoholic grape juice, sparkling wine and other beverages, wine-based products are currently not subject to these import duties. However, it's pretty clear to everyone that there's a lot of trouble getting across the border and that shipments are being held up no matter what you have, and no matter even if you've got bottled wine and wanting to pay the duty. So there's still a lot of border issues. You've probably read in the press, you probably saw some media the other day about people diversifying the route to market by sending or exporting to another country, modifying the product and re-exporting to China. I can say that apart from being probably economically unviable, probably won't work. And I think that all businesses need to be aware of those sovereign risks about this approach. The problems that Australia's having with China are political in nature. They're not about the product, and so they will be designed so people cannot circumvent the rules. Therefore, the options we're left is try market diversification. As I say, there's probably 120 million litres of red wine, 130 million litres total of wine that we need to find a home for. Really easy word to say, diversification. It's got lots of syllables, but it's simple to say. Problem is, it's not easy. It takes time, and you've got to find other markets, and you've got to find other markets at the price point that China has. And unfortunately, that's quite difficult. The good thing is most of our, a lot of our exporters are diversified. We've got a lot of markets we're already sell to. A lot of the people here do not have other markets, and China is their own market. So for the best option there is to look around and find where we can go. And Damien's going to talk about some of those options in a minute. Obviously, Asia is something that is a particular target for us. We've got a strong footprint in there. We've probably neglected it over recent years because of the China market being so strong and paying such high value. So the key to us is growing markets in there and market share. So yeah, Damien will talk a bit more about what we're doing on that at the moment and what others are doing and where the options are. And Rachel will also touch on that as well. It's pretty clear, though, in China we need to maintain some market recognition. So we cannot neglect China as an industry body, and we won't. Brand protection becomes very important. We're very concerned of what will happen to some of our brands, particularly with some of the piracy and some of the counterfeiting and some of the copycat that is going on within China. So we are looking at strategies to try and deal with that. Obviously, we all have to work on those industry and government relationships. We personally have very good relationships with Chinese industry and also Chinese government. We've been going there a lot and we've developed quite strong relationships. It's not something that we are trying to exploit at the moment. We don't think it's the right time, but there are some very close relationships that we hold with counterparts in China, and we value those. And obviously, we need to be able to maintain those business partnerships and supply chains. We do need to do this together. This is going to have to be a collective approach in market diversification, and there's been a lot of work done with Australia and Wine Australia and ourselves on looking at those opportunities, and the federal government is going to come to the party, but it's going to be an industry-government partnership. So we would encourage all of those of you to work with us to achieve these priorities and make sure we know what they are, because we know we'll be back in that marketplace, and we need to prepare for that when the day comes. So it's not just we're not just going to leave China alone. It's too valuable a market. The consumers love our product. So everything we do has to be an eye that one day we'll be coming back. It's clear to me that China will fly high again. We really genuinely believe that the opportunities will be there, but we must look at that market diversification now. And what we're going to enter is a very difficult period for the sector. So grape prices already came under pressure this year. It's very clear to me that next year is going to be a lot more significant. There are certainly wineries now who are concentrating on China, who are having trouble paying for those grapes they have purchased. That's putting pressure on grape growers and winemakers. And it's going to be critical that we make sure those relationships stay strong, and there's a lot of honesty and openness in those relationships between grape growers and winemakers, because otherwise we're going to end up with a whole lot of regulatory impost on us as well, which will make any structural imbalance that we have, at least in the short term, become far more significant. So thank you very much for your time. That was just some few introductory comments of where we're up to. As I say, we'll have questions later. But now I'm going to introduce you to Damien Graffanti. Damien works for Australian Grape and Wine. He's our Manager of Policy and Market Access. Damien's been working for us for a considerable amount of time, and he's got a lot of experience. He chairs a number of international committees. He's worked all around the world. He's had experience within China, and he's not only a very talented individual, but I think he's got a good story to tell. So Damien, I'll introduce you now and take over.
Thank you very much, Tony, and welcome again to everyone here for today's seminar. So as was alluded to, my job today is to talk to you a little bit about some of the priorities and some of the strategies that we're putting in place to work on market diversification. Obviously, as Tony's mentioned, it is not something that's easy, and it won't be something that's done quickly, but it's something we need to make sure we're focusing on and putting effort into in the short, medium and long term to try to deliver on some of our key priorities. I'll talk a little bit about the available resources that are being put forward, mainly through government resourcing and other sources, and also look at some of those key priority markets and how they're being looked at in terms of their different priorities. So I thought we'd need to, if we're looking at our reasons for existing in this export market, we need to look very high level at the industry strategy for vision for 2050. Now this document is a high level long-term vision for the industry, and it sets out a key target of export value of 10 billion by 2050. Now, a lot of people have asked whether the impacts of 2020 change that target, and for us the answer is no, because it is a long-term vision and it's something we need to continue to work towards. So it's something we need to make sure we keep focusing on as we talking about market diversification. That is the priority, is trying to expand and build the growth in those markets. As I've said, no one's under the illusion that it'll be easy. It's hard work and it's going to take a lot of time. Short, medium and long-term priorities, we are very focused on the long term in this. There is a lot of effort we need to do right now to try to help the businesses that are suffering in that short term, but really we need to really look at this with a long-term lens on it. We also need to make sure that we're spreading our efforts quite broadly. There is no single silver bullet that resolves trade, the export issues that we've had. It is going to be something that needs to be done really broadly across a range of different markets, and looking at trying to build that value and growth across a range of markets. We also need to make sure that we're not flooding markets, and making sure that we've taken a real strategic approach to how we go about that market diversification. So these are some of the supports that have been announced in recent years, and some of the resourcing that's going to be available. The major one that was announced, I think, at the end of 2020 was the Agribusiness Expansion Initiative by the federal government. So that's broken down into a couple of different tranches for different departments within agriculture, including Austrade and some of their business services within Austrade, as well as a number of different supports that agriculture, the Department of Agriculture will be providing over the next couple of years. There's also the industry levies that go to Wine Australia. That's another source of resourcing that will be talked about a little bit more in terms of what Wine Australia is delivering by Rachel in the subsequent slides. And there's also been a number of state governments who have put forward either packages or different buckets of money or funding to support the industry or industries affected by closures of markets. So the way we've been looking at this from a high-level strategic point of view is in terms of breaking down the activity that occurs underneath them, underneath some of these funding sources, and one of you can basically break it down into three different categories of business supports. So those are things like the business training and education, in-market supports, all sorts of different things that people are providing to producers to help them understand markets, things like data, intel and that sort of thing. There's marketing promotion, which is a big part of what the Wine Australia marketing will do, is promoting Australian premium wine. And then there's also the trade and market access space, dealing with removing trade barriers and looking at expanding free trade agreements across a number of different nations. We, Australian Grape and Wine, will be using our focus in all of this market diversification work will be mainly in filling gaps that have been left in the short term with other resourcing that haven't been filled, and also looking at the long-term strategic trade and market access work. So in terms of trying to prioritise markets, there's a lot of things that have been discussed at a high level across both government and industry sources, acknowledging that there are a lot of differing priorities at both a business level or a state level or a regional level in terms of where the focus should be. These were the sort of categorisation that have been discussed in terms of trying to prioritise different markets. So we looked at Tier 1, which are the very well-established markets that we all have had a lot of experience in and have had a lot of exports and success in, like the US, Canada and UK. There's the markets that are Tier 2 markets that we're referring to, that are those that are established but might have either room to grow or room to build market share in. And then there's those emerging markets where there are, they're not necessarily big markets for Australian wine exports at the moment, or we haven't had as much exposure in those markets. And that's where a lot of focus will be in terms of filling some of those gaps as well. So I'll just take you through a few of those markets and some of the things that we're looking at in terms of the different individual markets. So there's a very large investment going into marketing and promotion in all of these Tier 1 markets in the US, Canada and the UK. There's also a need for support for market entry, particularly in the US and Canada, which are typically quite tricky markets in terms of new market entry. Rachel will talk a little bit about the US market entry stuff, I think. UK obviously is a very large volume market existing for us, and we are currently in negotiations for an FTA with the UK, and we have a really long-standing trade and political relations that are quite good with the UK. So that's something that will hold us in good stead as we progress these markets. The Tier 2 markets, the approach will vary in each of those. A lot of these markets don't have high levels of technical barriers to trade. So markets like Singapore and Hong Kong and New Zealand and Japan, they don't tend to have that many technical barriers remaining. So that's quite beneficial for us. We also have really strong trade relations with many of these. And for the most part, in a lot of these markets, consumers have a fairly good understanding of Australian wine, but it's something that we need to still build on or develop in certain markets. Like I say, they're different in particular markets. Then there's the Tier 3 emerging markets, and there's again a whole lot of different approaches to each of these. They all have varying levels of opportunity. A lot of them are probably smaller, but potentially high value. There's potentially some of these have higher levels of technical barriers to trade, particularly nations that don't have as much wine industry or wine producing experience tend to have standards or requirements that don't quite suit the unique nature of wine. Geographical closeness in a lot of the Asian markets will be something that we think is quite an advantage for us in terms of exports to those markets. I just wanted to also touch on India for a bit. A lot of people have asked about India as a substitute for China in terms of its ability to take large volumes. We see India as a real long-term prospect. It's one that has a lot of potential, and you can see I've listed why we consider that to have a lot of potential there. There's currently a fair few barriers to entry in India, including the existing tariffs and complex taxation and differing state regulations. So it's not by any means a simple market for us to get in, but we believe that it's one that will be one that we can work on for in the long term and potentially have a lot of benefit once we succeed in getting into that market. In saying that, we already export the biggest volume into India currently, so we are actually already starting to build recognition in India as an importer of high valued wine. The other one on that list that I had was for Tier 3 markets was the Other Europe category, and Russia and Poland are ones that are spoken about quite often in that category. These are other European markets where we haven't seen very much in terms of exports in the past, but they do have a lot of potential for high value growth, and it's not something that we think should be neglected. There's a lot of technical complexity to some of these, but again, it is one that's a high value prospect for the future. The remaining one in that category is the Nordic countries. So you have your Denmarks, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. We believe that there's a real opportunity in these markets, particularly in our sustainability message that the Australian wine industry has. There's a lot of work to be done in the retailer space to put forward Australian wine's case for its really strong sustainability credentials, and that's something that's highly valued in those markets. And it's a story we have, it's just one we need to build on and promote more in those markets, and there's a lot of potential for growth in those as well. I will leave it at that and bring it back to Tony to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. And I think one of the points to make is that we're currently working with the government. We expect to get a considerable amount of funding to help some of these both marketing activities, some of those Tier 2 markets, but also some of the market access issues in the longer term markets. So expect an announcement sometime either around a budget or in the next month or so. So been a lot of work going into that. So the next speaker is Eric Wilkes. For those of you who've ever had a problem with your wine and wanted something fixed or wanting to send it analysed, it's Eric who does that. He either tells you what you've done wrong, and then even more importantly tells you how to fix it, or he'll analyse it and then tell you what you've done wrong and tell you how to fix it. We've worked a lot with Eric over recent times, apart from his professional job with AWRI, but also on the market access issues. He's got a very broad strategic view, and welcome you to the podium, Eric.
Thanks, Tony. I've got a good team of people who fix your wine. It'd be foolish to ask me for it all. Look, one of the things that I think is really a driver in Australia is we have an incredible level of technical excellence in wine. Compared to any other nation, we have the most integrated technical backup to the thing. We have an institute dedicated to wine, which is essentially owned by the wine industry. It's paid for by levies, etc. And within that you know, it's been around since 1955. It has vast amounts of experience. There's about 120 people there. And then that sort of influence spreads across our whole wine industry in that technically Australian wine is very, very competent and advanced. But that's not to say that Australia makes wine technically. We make wine to stylistic and quality drivers. And that's one of the big strengths. We don't sell, we haven't been as incredibly successful as we have simply because we're technically very good. It's because we've made wines that people want to drink. The great thing is it's backed up by that technical excellence. And I've worked with people all over the world, and I can say with total confidence that the Australian wine industry does have the best technical backup of anywhere. Now, one of the nice things about working in the wine industry, and I have worked across a number of industries, but mostly in the wine industry, is that wine, that technical skill isn't required in any way to make wine a safe product. Wine is, when made from grapes using normal processes, I won't say natural processes because yes, all wine's made naturally, but that has different connotations these days. It is essentially a very safe product. There are no pathogens that can grow in wine that can poison you. You can't get salmonella from wine. You can't get E. coli. The biological processes that we see in wine just don't generate those pathogens. And that's because of the combination of alcohol, acid and phenolic compounds. The levels of byproducts from fermentation, once again, aren't there at levels which can be a problem. You know, we often hear about people raising regulatory issues around methanol. There's literally more in orange juice, okay? So it's once again a safe product. The fermentation process doesn't lend itself to making things that can be dangerous. Grapes don't contain significant levels of things like heavy metals or other toxic substances, okay? If you put into a bunch of grapes, people say, oh, that's a healthy snack. Well, when we convert it to wine, that healthy snack's just been converted across to there, okay? It's there. There's nothing we're adding to it that leads to that sort of problems. And our production practices don't add any significant levels of these things. Now, I say significant because I'll mention it a bit later, a bit more, but pretty well everything is in wine because everything's out there in the environment, okay? It's coming from a natural environment, it's coming through. But we don't add anything significant in our production practices that leads to danger in wine. Ethanol is probably the biggest risk in wine, and when it's consumed responsibly, that's not an issue as well. So in short, when consumed responsibly, wine doesn't pose any health risk. In fact, it's actually quite a lot safer than a number of other beverages. If we're looking at the health star ratings for products, for beverages out there, now they don't apply to wine, but if you look at those health star ratings, wine actually scores higher than many other beverages that you could buy, mostly because of the influence of sugar. Most products have 100 plus grams per litre of sugar, which when you consume reasonable amounts of them is not good. So the only time that we see wine as posing health risks, and we see this in cases around the world occasionally, is fake wine. So when you hear about people, hundreds of people getting sick because of methanol or something like that in wine, I can guarantee you it's because they made it by getting some spirits, some colouring, putting it together with a bit of water and selling it as wine. That's not wine. So wine itself just can't get to those levels. And that fake wine is actually one of the risks that we see out there. So wine authenticity becomes an issue as we move through these things. Now, big thing to know is it's not a new problem. There's some great archaeology done where they've had a look at some clay tablets from Roman times, and it's a guy complaining that the amphora of wine he got was not from where he said it was. Okay, this is not from whichever set of hills in actually in Tuscany, so we're still complaining about whether wine's really from Tuscany or not. But those processes, that issue is a long-running one. And food fraud in general, not just wine, is a massive world issue, and it's something to be considered through there. So what can we do about it? First thing we need to understand is that wine is different to a lot of other foods, and that's mainly because of the massive transformation. We go from a bunch of fruit to an alcoholic beverage, from a high sugar material to a very low sugar beverage, in most cases, with a large amount of alcohol generated in it. So that transformation changes it. So it's not like, say, grains, where in general, when we sell those overseas, what we test at one end is pretty well the same thing we've got at the other end. So it's massively transformed. We expect year-to-year variation. We go out of our way to talk about how much better one vintage is to another, and that variation is real, and it's reflected in the contents. We even emphasise differences between small geographic regions. So we actually say that one part of the Barossa is different to another. So when you try to say what's a typical Australian wine, quite reasonably most winemakers will throw rocks at you because they're saying, no, mine's unique. And once again, when we're trying to prove wine authenticity, that variation is part of the issue. It's a batch process. It's not done continuously. We made one batch a year, and each batch is going to be different. So it is a much more challenging thing to do provenance and authenticity on. To the point, we're doing a heap of work with CSIRO at the moment, and we're using wine as the model, because if we can get provenance sorted from wine, then we can probably do it for pretty well anything. So what is wine fraud? There's a few different forms, and it's really important to recognise this. Misrepresentation. Is it really a central Otago Pinot? Is it really a Barossa, Shiraz? Anything like that. Actually saying that it's from somewhere else than where it is. Counterfeiting, where we actually make a product and try to pass it off as another product. Is it really another Petrus? And then refill, where we take bottles of wine from another area, from somewhere that have been used, and refill them with another wine, put a capsule on it, and sell it as the original product. That's actually quite common in other beverages, and we have seen it in wine as a part of the process. So most of the solutions that we have and we use out there are using labelling and clever ideas around labelling bottles and our in-market presentation. And this is a quote directly from the senior technical person from one of our largest wine companies. And he made it very clear, it's not about making it impossible to counterfeit a wine. That can't be done. What it's about is making it harder to counterfeit your wine than it is someone else's competition or another product or another beverage. In other words, you want to make it harder for the people doing the counterfeiting. They want to go and look for somewhere they can make the money easy. So very important to keep in mind that we can't be counterfeiting. Even with the smartest label stuff, and I've been involved in a number of them, either you can do refills, or in a number of cases, when you're talking about those holographic labels and those sort of things, the same company that will make it for you will make it for the counterfeiter. Okay? And anyone who believes that's not happening is wrong. Okay? They will do it. They're very clever. They're making money. So we look at proprietary labelling in bottles, serialisation of bottle codes, having numbers that are linked to individual bottles, easily read with a consumer device. In other words, something that you can scan the bottle with, these barcodes. And an example is the QR codes that companies like Penfolds have used and are using successfully. These sort of tools are really very effective, okay? By using them to link to individual bottles and what we call big data, so people can go with a consumer device, scan it and say, yes, this did come from such and such. They gather the information and they use that to track fraud, okay? They don't always say okay, this bottle is a fake, they actually don't want to do that quite often in market. But what they do is say, okay, this has been scanned in this area, it's obviously not from there, so we'll get the local constabulary to go and raid that place, take those bottles out of circulation, and that's very, very effective. And it's worked really well for a number of large companies. You need to be producer and app agnostic, so if you're going down this sort of thing, you've got to be able to use it across lots of areas. And it helps to have unique, what we call codes that can be read for each bottle through the process. And it would be nice if it was linked to a payment system, so when someone buys a bottle of wine, it automatically gets that information through. And if you do have a code used like this, once it's used, it's got to be quarantined. You can't just keep using the same code over and over because that just plays into the hands of the counterfeiters. Now, if you do detect, and this is where the scientist in me comes into it and doing our analysis, if you do detect a fraud for a refill or just a direct counterfeit, it's actually incredibly easy for us to prove. People say, oh, it's hard to prove counterfeiting and that sort of thing. If you've got a reference bottle and you've got your possible counterfeit wine, it takes me on average an hour to give you a result that's 99.9999% certain, whether it is or not, okay? Don't worry too much about what that graph shows you, but that is actually a real case, not for either of these two products, by the way. I can't show that, but that's a case where we showed that, you know, there was a massive argument in a wine show whether the wine that was put in the wine show was the same one that was on the shelf, and we could show that, yeah, to less than 0.0001% probability, it was through there. And that sort of thing is incredibly easy. Honestly, it takes roughly an hour for us to do once we get the samples. Unfortunately, that involves having laboratories, and you can't just do that out in the field, which is why the labelling options are so important. Now, what we're hoping to do in the future is actually develop these things further so that we can test things at the time of packaging, and then in market, someone will be able to test it very quickly with a handheld device and use things like blockchain or similar technologies. Blockchain is not necessarily the answer, which will mean it's secure all the way through. This technology, we could implement it tomorrow in some forms. Where we're trying to take it to, working with partners like CSIRO and other industries, is actually making sure we can measure what the soil looks like in the vineyard, and then that gets reflected in the wine and record that all the way through. But that's not the thing that scares me. It honestly is. We can deal with counterfeit wine, we can deal with those sort of things through there. What scares me is showing the provenance of an unknown wine. So a wine with a, you know, we call them critter wines, some cute Australian animal stuck to the front label, sold in the market, leveraging our reputation as being a safe source of food and beverages. And this can be a major, major issue. Toxic milk scandal led to huge ramifications out there with people killed. We have seen it with wines, not necessarily Australian wines, but wines marketed as wines. As I said, high levels of methanol, they weren't real, are a problem. My nightmare scenario is someone making a wine with a dangerous additive, maybe a dangerous colorant, that to make it look better, they've taken a cheap wine, they've added something to it, it's called an Australian wine, and people die, and then that gets our market. Do we have tools to be able to demonstrate clearly that that wine wasn't Australian? That's a really, really difficult task to do, because one of the really big problems, and I think people don't always get, is 98% of wine is alcohol and water. All the bits that make it different are squeezed into 2%. Okay? Only 2%, that 2% of the volume is what makes every wine different. Okay, the rest of it's the same, so most of that bottle, so we're starting to get down to really, really small amounts. And when you're starting to look at that, in that 2%, less than 0.1% of it is really truly unique and doesn't change as the wine gets older. So we have to be very careful about our targets from a chemistry point of view. And the other thing is literally every known natural element found in nature can be found in wine. Often in incredibly small amounts, but every known element's there. So there's no magic thing that we can say, point at and say, this is only going to be in Australian wine, etc. It really is an incredible soup of wonderful things that make it what it is, but everything is there. So technically it's a massive challenge. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the good news is, yes, we can do it. We've made huge move forwards in this, and we use what we call a multi-parameter approach. And this is really just saying that what we're doing is we're not looking at any one thing. We're saying, well, what can we see from the air? What comes from the water? What comes from the soil? What's unique to us there? And most people would call that terroir. We wouldn't go that far. We'd say we're using a multi-parameter approach. But the nice thing is that using, isotopes, what we call stable isotopic measurements from this sort of thing, we can these days say with very high levels of confidence whether a wine was Australian or not. Now the bad news is you can't do this in the bottle shop. Okay, we need to take it out, put it into complex testing, but you can do those sort of things now. So that nightmare scenario of a wine being claimed as Australian leading to health issues, we should be able to, or we definitely will be able to show very conclusively if it was or not an Australian wine and probably how it was contaminated. Just a little bit of a warning there that I'll chuck in. You'll see a lot of people trying to sell you opportunities to prove the authenticity of your wine, just get involved in this program, etc. A lot of them rely on what we would call 95% certainty. 95% certainty means 1 in 20 will be wrong, and although that hasn't been picked up in legal proceedings to date, there's been legal cases in Australia about provenance that have been tested scientifically. That's some of these things are going to be challenged in court, so you need to make sure if you get involved in any programs which claim that they're going to be able to show chemically the provenance of wine, that you have a much higher degree of certainty than the typical levels that people are promoting. Very quickly, varietal identification or identification. Yeah, it should have been I there, but that's okay. Is another issue that we see through there. People will point at this all the time and say, surely we can just do DNA testing. Definitely can't do that in your kitchen. It's quite complex. The problem is winemaking actually screws up DNA. The way to get rid of DNA is to add alcohol. You may not have noticed, but that's one of the constituents we have in wine. So most of the DNA gets blown apart through there, so we end up looking for fragments of DNA. Some people have had success looking for other chemical markers like proteins and a few other chemicals in wine. What I can say is there is no really good method yet to totally identify what varietals are in your wine. There's claims, there's been some really great work done, but it's sort of a bit of a hit and miss thing at the moment. We can usually do it with a degree of certainty for individual varietals that have never been blended. But as soon as you start putting blending and that in there, it becomes very, very difficult. And as we know, wines can be made from multiple varieties, and when we're looking at fragments, that stuffs it up, and not all those varieties are labelled. And the reality is when we talk to varietals, if you're looking at the Australian context, there's no rules saying what you can grow where, so that's not a big help in the process. And we have the addition of concentrates. So look, that's just something I've tried to squeeze it into a much shorter talk than I can. The area of wine authenticity is hours and hours of discussion, and you're welcome to come and talk to me. I I promise I won't talk for hours, but I could. So there's a lot going on in this area. There's a huge amount of research still happening, but we have made huge progress. And the major thing to learn about that, I think, is that we do have solutions out there. It's not just sitting there with nothing happening at the moment. We can do most of what people need to do. It's just maybe not in market yet. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And I should point out that copycat, counterfeit and fraudulent wine is not a third world problem. It's a first world problem. It exists everywhere. We've been working with the ATO over the last 6 to 8 months about a counterfeit product that we found in Australia. It's purports to be a South African product. It's in an Australian bottle. So the whole issue of counterfeit is alive and well. So it's something that's a shared problem that we need to work with everyone to resolve. I would also point out that what Eric didn't say, probably his last international trip before COVID was doing some work that we were doing in China in the Australia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Food Safety Cooperation Forum, where Eric's been involved in doing work sponsored by China, which is dealing with lab ring testing and better quality of getting better results from labs. So it's another example of where we've been heavily involved in working with some of the other countries in some of these areas. Look, the next speaker is a man who really does need no introduction. For that, he was obviously a winemaker, so he's probably on the other side of the fence, but he redeemed himself. So Steve's someone I've worked with for a long, long time. He knows his stuff. He's going to talk a bit about the regulatory type activities that are happening and some of those problems that we're facing. So thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Tony. Tony did mention in his earlier talk about some of the deteriorating relationship with China and in fact even today the suspension by China of a particular agreement as a strategic economic cooperation agreement. But I'm going to talk about this one, the Australia-China Agricultural Cooperation Agreement, which at least at this stage is still in force. It's not, as I had thought at one stage, something that was introduced in conjunction with the Free Trade Agreement chapter. In fact, it's been around since 1984, long time. And we being Australian Grape and Wine, applied for some funding under the terms of this agreement some 15 months ago now to try and address some of the regulatory problems that confront exporters of wine to China. And we've got some results, which I'm going to share with you now. It's unfortunate, of course, that with the situation we face, that we can't take full advantage of these results, but at least it'll put us in a position to, when things do improve, as we certainly hope and expect they will, to be able to make life a little bit easier for Australian exporters at that time. So it probably shouldn't be any surprise to you that wine is regulated as a food in most markets around the world, particularly in Australia and in China. In fact, some would say that it's an essential food. But the details of those regulations, as you might expect, can vary from one country to another. So something that's permitted to be used in food, in wine, in one country, may not be permitted in another. So that can cause a problem, of course, if you're using a particular additive or technique in Australia and you want to then send that wine to a country which doesn't permit that additive or technique, because generally it's the case that the regulation in the importing country applies to the food or wine that is sold in that market, regardless of whether it's made in that market or it's imported. So if something's not permitted by Chinese law, the fact that you can use it in Australia is no help to you. Now, we've dealt with that problem over the years in various ways with other markets other than China. So, for example, there's a group called the World Wine Trade Group. And this consists of 9 countries: Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, some South American countries, Chile, Argentina and Uruguay, South Africa, and they, of course, you could all put under the rubric New World wine producing countries, but just to add to that, the country of Georgia in Europe is also a member. And this is really an exemplary way of dealing with this problem about different regulation, because what that group of countries has done is said, we don't care if our laws are different from yours. We don't care. We will accept wine, and only wine, we're not talking about all food here, wine from each of those countries, provided it's made in accordance with your law. So, for example, you have an Australian product made in accordance with Australian law. You want to send that to any of those countries, and some of our major markets are there. I mentioned the United States, I mentioned Canada, I mentioned New Zealand, 3 of our 5 largest markets. You can send that wine to those 3 markets, even if you're using a technique that's not permitted in that market. That is the ideal situation. But China is not a member, unfortunately, of that group. We'd love them to be, and they have been as observers. Officials have been as observers to some of our meetings, but they're not a member. We've also got agreements with the United Kingdom and with the European Union, which sit outside any free trade agreement that may eventually come with either of those markets through the current negotiations. We have agreements with those 2 markets, the UK and the EU, which essentially recognise Australia's law. It's not quite the same as that automatic mutual acceptance that the World Wine Trade Group has, but it's still pretty good. And in practice, it means wine made in accordance with Australian law can go to our main market, or markets, of the UK and the EU. Okay, but as I said, that is not the case with China. So just to set the scene and show you the problem here with China, the law, the winemaking law and the general food law of the 2 countries are codified in Australia in something called the Food Standards Code. It also, in fact, applies to New Zealand. It's a common code. There's 4 parts to that code. You can see the 4 headings there. You can't read it. I'll just quickly explain. Starting from the left, there were some general standards in that code that apply to all foods, like labelling standards. So things like having to put an allergen warning if you've got egg, milk, fish products, that sort of thing. Some labelling standards. The second are specific standards for certain foods. So there's milk and there's eggs and there's wine. And the law that applies to wine applies to all wine. As I said earlier, whether it's Australian, whether it's New Zealand, or whether it's imported. The third heading there is really doesn't concern us too much unless you're actually serving food or preparing food, because it's mainly sort of safety standards for use in hospitality and food preparation. And as Eric said, with wine, we're not really that concerned so much about microbiological contamination from a safety point of view, maybe from a quality point of view, but certainly not from a safety point of view. And finally, and it is quite relevant, there are some primary production standards in there. Wine is included, and importantly, the standard that applies to wine there only applies to Australian wine. And what is unique about it is that the standard that applies to Australian wine is stricter than the one that applies to imported product. And I think that's unique. I don't think there's any other country in the world that applies a stricter standard to the production of their wine than it does to imported wine. If only every country was like Australia in that regard. And on the left there, you can see something called GB2760. This is the Chinese national standard for the production of all foods, including wine. The current version of that is dated 2014. Some say 2015, but in fact that's the date it came into force. But it's actually a 2014 version. And I just quickly want to run through that in case you feel that you want to be able to familiarise yourself with that code. Here's a typical entry from the GB2760 standard. And I've chosen this one because it reflects the problem, or one of the problems that Australia has in sending wine to that market. So this is the entry for something called metatartaric acid. Now, metatartaric acid can be used in wine in Australia, but importantly from this entry, might be hard for you to read there, but the only food, what this tells you is the only food in which you can use metatartaric acid in China is canned fruit. There is only one entry for metatartaric acid, and it is canned fruit. You can't use it in anything else, including wine. This is something, however, this is tartaric acid, and in fact it also applies to the mixture of the two different types of tartaric acid, the D and L version. There's a slight typo there in the translation at the bottom, but you can see that in this case, tartaric acid, it can be used in a whole range of different foods, including at the bottom there, the code number 15.03.01, which is grape wine. So you can use it in grape wine, with the caveat that you mustn't exceed that limit there of 4 grams per litre. That's not 4 grams per litre in total, but that's 4 grams per litre added. So we all know that tartaric acid is naturally occurring, and you commonly have more than 4 grams per litre in a wine, but you're limited to an addition of 4 grams in China. Okay, I'm just going to skip over a little bit. I'll come back to that. Because I want to point out a trap for young players. If you do ever look at that code, and some of you may from time to time, you have to take care. Because if you do, you'll see a table A.2, which says, and I've extracted a few of them, the following are permitted food additives in all foods. And it's a lengthy list, and I've extracted a few there which are relevant to wine, because those 6, carrageenan, carboxymethylcellulose, etc., are all permitted for use in Australian wine. So you might think, hey, that's fine, we can use them. Well, you can't in wine, even though it says it's permitted for all wines, because you also have to look at table A.3. One of the dangers if you ever look at these things on a computer screen. If you've got a book, you might see the two, but if you're looking at a computer screen, you might miss table 8.3, because that said there are exceptions. And grape wine, 15.03.01, is one of those exceptions. That exception is a bad thing, not a good thing. It means that grape wine cannot avail itself of that list of commonly permitted food additives. So let's go back. And if you go through the entire standard, which I've done many times, it's a very big document, but if you do, and you compare it with Australia's food code, you will find 11 additives and 19 processing aids which are permitted here, which are not permitted in China. Although, as I say, there is a slight caveat there. 6 of those additives, including a couple of those acids that are on the following slide, can be used as processing aids. The distinction is that an additive is something that stays in the wine. Processing aid is something that's not expected to stay in the wine. So when you fine a wine, you don't expect the fining agent to stay in the wine, except in trivial amounts. And that's a problem, because 3 of those processing aids that are not permitted in China, milk products, egg products, and plant proteins, pea protein is commonly used, are not permitted. They're 3 of those total of 30 items that I mentioned on the earlier slide. And I'm now coming to the results, one of the key results of the project that we've been working on in recent months through that agricultural cooperation agreement. Because what we discovered and what we confirmed through that project is that even though they're not permitted by the Food Code, Australian winemakers can use them and send that wine to China. I wish we'd known that a few years ago. And this is the benefit, one of the benefits of this project. The reason you can use them, we can use them, is that they are foods in themselves. So given that they're foods in themselves, and if there's anything else that happens to be a food which can be used, permitted in Australia, you can use it on wine going to China. And the reason that's important is not only because it means we have now the ability to use those products in wine in Australia, that shortly allergen labelling, which at the moment in China is voluntary, is about to become compulsory in wine. It will happen very soon. The legislation's drafted, it's out there, we're just waiting for the Chinese to push the button and say you must do it. And of course, it's a problem if you mention on the label that you've used egg or milk well, I don't think plant proteins are actually an allergen, but egg and milk definitely are, if you're not allowed to use it in the first place. So now you will be able to comply with the allergen labelling law and a requirement and not expose yourself to any action. Okay, another key outcome from the winemaking perspective, and I'm going to spend much time on this because we are running out of time, but you know, I mentioned that there were 30 items that we can't use. Well, that's 27 now because we've covered off on the milk and the egg, but there's still 27, which obviously we would prefer to be able to use on wine going to that market. What we were able to achieve through this research that we've been conducting over the last few months is a guide, a very comprehensive guide to how we would go about having the law changed in China to permit some, if not all, of those 27 materials to be used in that market. It details the contacts, the organisations, the content of the submission that would need to be prepared, and some of the costs that are associated with it, and they are significant. But at least we have a roadmap to how we can address, when we need them, those 27 outstanding materials. Okay, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time now talking about another outcome of this project, and this is a viticultural one. So downy mildew is a fairly common fungal disease of grapes. It can cause severe economic loss because it has fairly significant effects on yield in particular. And there's a vineyard spray, phosphorus acid, which can be applied and is commonly applied. The unique thing about it is that phosphorus acid, there's plenty of other sprays that you can use to control downy mildew, but the unique thing about phosphorus acid is that it's useful both to prevent infection and, if you've already got infection, to deal with it. There aren't too many chemicals you can use which have that dual capacity. It's very safe, it's legal for use in Australia and in most countries around the world. Even though it's legal to use in China on some fruits, I think blackberries, but it's not legal to use on grapes. However, there's a very closely related material, something called phosphatyl al, the al short for aluminium, which can be used. And what we found through our research in this project is that, in fact, the regulations regarding phosphatyl al result in a de facto residue limit, maximum residue limit, for phosphorus acid, of 7.5 parts per million. So if you use phosphorus acid in Australia and you don't exceed 7.5 parts per million, you should have no problem selling that wine in China. Problem, though, is that 7.5 parts per million is not very much. Australia's limit's quite high, much higher than that. And Codex, which is a sort of national standard, international standard-setting body from the Food and Agriculture Organisation and the World Health Organisation, and Australia and China are both members, but their limit is 60, not 7.5, but 60. So the problem is that Australians haven't been able to use phosphorus acid in the way they would want to use to control downy mildew, and they're probably not likely to be in the future, despite the fact we have this knowledge that there is a small tolerance for its use in China. But what we have through the project is similar to the winemaking paper. We have a document which will guide us through the necessary steps in order to A, have phosphorus acid registered in China, have the limit increased, and the current limit changed from a temporary one to a permanent one. Okay, so really that is, sorry about that, going the wrong way. That's all I want to say. It's disappointing, really, that we got some very useful information out of this project and that we can't use it. Well, yes, of course we can use it, but the winemakers can't really use it at the moment, or can't take full advantage of it. But at least we're in a position that when the situation improves in China, and I think we can confidently say when rather than if, that we'll be able to put the industry in a better position than they were even before the problem started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Excellent presentation, and Codex is considering, as you say, it's got a higher limit, and one thing about China is they normally adopt Codex standards, so there is prospects there as well. The next and final speaker, before we can have a drink, is not putting you under pressure, Rachel, is Rachel Triggs from Wine Australia. Look, Rachel's got a really interesting presentation. She'll touch on a lot of the issues that we've all touched and bring it to, I think, a very fitting conclusion. I think, Steve, your point about that it is not, it is when we're back with China is the right thing. I think certainly one day that we will be back there. Rachel, you're up.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to Australian Grape and Wine for the invitation to come and talk to you today. So as foreshadowed by Tony, I am from Wine Australia, so just so everyone's clear, Australian Grape and Wine are the industry body, so member-based body that have standing underneath the Wine Australia Act, under which Wine Australia is established. And we absolutely work hand in glove very well with Australian Grape and Wine, so very pleased to be here today. So what does Wine Australia do? Wine Australia's got broadly 3 statutory remits. So we invest in grape and wine research and development. We don't actually do any of the dirty work ourselves. We leave that to the likes of Eric Wilkes. We control the export of wine from Australia. And we promote the consumption and sale of wine both domestically and overseas, and work very closely with Australian Grape and Wine on enhancing commercial opportunities through regulation and market access, and also market insights, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now I've gone back. So on the regulatory framework, Wine Australia, as I mentioned, administer the export controls on wine, including licensing, product approval and shipping approval. We regulate things like the blending rules, so enforcing that 85% rule on vintage, variety and origin claims. We control the description of presentation of wine, so we're the ones that you get into trouble with if you call a wine a champagne when it's not a champagne, it's not from Champagne. We administer compliance with the Food Standards Code at the point of export, and the label integrity program as well. Now, I think it's really important to note at this juncture that we've spoken a lot. Eric's spoken about sort of copycat and counterfeit and all that sort of thing. We've heard about how wine is a very safe product. So it can sort of beg the question as to why wine is so heavily regulated. And it is very heavily regulated, not just by Australia, but by most wine-producing countries. And it's nothing to do with the fact it's got alcohol. You often have people assume that, you know, it's because it's got alcohol, so it needs to be very heavily regulated. Of course, you know, it is regulated by liquor licensing authorities and the like from a domestic perspective. But it is much more broad than that. It really is about protecting the reputation of Australian wine. And this is something that dates back to the 1930s. So 1930, Australia already had a very well-established wine sector. At that point in time, demand from the UK in particular became so great for fortified wine that people were compelled to start making adulterated wine, which Eric spoke about before. So wine that wasn't necessarily actually wine, it was product that had alcohol, it had flavour, it had water, and it was compromised. And so the UK pretty much turned its back on the Australian market for 3 decades or so. So unlike what happens in a lot of regulatory spaces, it's actually industry that went to government at that point in time and wanted some export controls placed on Australian wine. And there remains very strong support from industry for the regulation of Australian wine today. There aren't many things that you need a specific export permit to get out of Australia. And I know that you're dying to know what the other things are apart from wine. You've got endangered animals, firearms, radioactive material, and precious metals and ore and that sort of thing. So, you know, it really is quite bespoke regulatory system in that regard. Now, the label integrity program remains a real focus for us. You know, I've got to say we are operating in a very limited funding envelope with what's happened with China. You know, our regulatory activities are funded on a fees basis, so fees that we collect for licences, for shipping approval, for product approvals, etc. We haven't raised fees, but we are still very committed to maintaining the regulatory framework of the Australian sector. And Eric spoke before about the difficulties in identifying, I think he might have spoken about, you know, vintage, variety and origin from an analytical perspective. It really is very difficult. So what has ensued is the label integrity program, which we continue to administer, which relies on anyone in the supply chain maintaining records that verify the vintage, variety and origin of products. So that remains a very important part of what Wine Australia does. And to enhance that regulatory framework, we are about to launch a label directory for Australian wine. So from the 1st of June, it will become mandatory for exporters to upload images of the labels for any product, for any labelled product, into our Wine Australia licensing and approval system as part of the product approval stage of that process. And those labels will be pulled across into a public-facing searchable database. So for anybody that's used the ATMOS database, so the Australian Trademark Office searchable database, it will be very similar to that. It will go live on the 1st of July, by which point in time we hope we've actually got some labels in it. And you'll be able to search by entering text or by uploading images to identify labels that might infringe upon your intellectual property. So this is very much a system for the public to use. It is not a system through which Wine Australia will regulate the use of brands. It'll give brand owners another toolkit to identify breaches of their intellectual property rights and to prove instances in which their intellectual property has been breached. And on the consumer side, it will give a consumer the opportunity to verify that a product has actually been exported from Australia and to which markets it's been exported. So we're really excited about the launch of that. We have recently released an export report. So one of the benefits of having the export controls in-house is that we do collect some really, really beautifully rich data that we can share with the sector. So every quarter we release an export report. We released an export report last week to the end of March. And not surprisingly, there is an overall decline in exports for the 12 months to March 2021, but there is significant growth in other export markets. So up 23% in Europe to 710 million, which is the highest value in a decade. Also growth in North America up 5% to 628 million, and in Oceania up 7% to 112 million. So despite the doom and gloom of China, there really is some positivity out there. Important to remember that China accounted for 15% of volume, 40% of value, but it is 15% of volume. And it does seem that that is being redirected to other markets. We've been pretty busy at One Australia the last couple of weeks. We've very recently released this interactive insights dashboard. So this is again a resource that is available to the public. It supplements what we already had on our website, which was a market explorer tool where you could actually dive very deeply into individual import markets to look at trends, consumer trends, supply and demand, etc. You can jump on here. It's live now. That we've had a soft launch this week, and there's a media release going out next week. And you can search by market, by individual category type, by red, by white, by sparkling, by date. So I very strongly encourage everybody to jump on and have a really good look at this. You can download these sort of charts that you can see here, and it's all free to levy payers. On the marketing front, as you can imagine, with COVID restrictions, we've had to pivot. I think that was definitely the word of last year, wasn't it? To come up with some fairly unique ways that we can connect Australian exporters with distributors and retailers and importers, etc. So we're very focused on investment in our key markets, US, Canada, UK, those more traditional markets. And we're working very closely with Austrade in that regard. And priority markets, you know, the investment, the money that we have available, of course, is not as big as what it was with the 50 million package that we've just finished administering. But there are some really great assets that have come out of that 50 million that we are continuing to leverage on, and the industry will be able to continue to utilise into the future. So just a few of those. Australia Wine Connect, again, there's a lot of detail here. All the information's on our website. This is a really exciting initiative, and it's an online platform to connect business to business. So we've currently got almost 2,000 products registered on this platform. We've got over 250 wineries registered, and we are putting wineries directly in contact with distributors, retailers, importers. There's chat rooms, there's opportunity for producers to control their own content upload. So very much encourage you to have a look at how you might be able to benefit from being involved in that platform. We're doing a series of distributor and retail promotions in the US, which has been a really, really interesting project because navigating the 3-tier system in the US is really interesting. So as a producer in the US, you're not allowed to talk to a retailer. You're barely allowed to sort of look sideways at a retailer. So we've been able to go in there really as a bit of a neutral body and do some really good work with distributors and retailers in that market. Australian Wine Discovered is a program that we've established that, again, it's an educational program. It is open to anybody to use. It is a resource that all of you in this room now can use, can share with trade, can share with consumers. So I'd encourage you to look at that as well. Our market entry program in the US is a pay-to-play initiative in the US, whereby, again, anybody that's export ready can utilise that program to try and grow in the US. And I should note as well that there are some wine export grants available at the moment. So the federal government has made the second round of wine export grants available. It's $1 million that's up for grabs to co-fund any research development, market development opportunities in any market. So it was in the first round, which was $1.5 million, it was just China and the US. It's been expanded now out to all markets, and it includes research, market research development as well, and it would include matching funding for participating in a program like the market entry program. We continue to work really closely with the provincial liquor boards in Canada. So, of course, the provinces in the only way you can sell wine or liquor into most of Canada is to sell it to the government. So there aren't many customers, but with each of those customers we do work really closely with. We've got really strong social media presence. If you're not already sort of following on LinkedIn, all of these initiatives are always posted through LinkedIn, so absolutely get on board with that. And we're also working really closely with Australian Grape and Wine and AWRI, the Australian Wine and Research Institute, on the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia program, and we've just launched a website that I'd encourage you to get online and have a look at as well. Steve touched on the fact that we maintain a series of export market guides. We've got an export market for China that we're looking to upgrade next week. It's going to include some really valuable information about bottling and market for anybody that is looking to export bulk wine to China and bottle it there, because there are some nuances around labelling, particularly country of origin labelling, etc. So look out for that. It should be on our website next week. And 100% just stay informed. You know, I've given you a lot of information today, but there are all sorts of ways that you can opt in to receive all this sort of information. You don't have to receive everything. You can hop onto our website and tick the boxes to let us know what you're interested in, and stay informed, because there's a lot of very, very valuable information that is freely available to all of you in this room, and you need to make sure that you're across what is available so you can make the most of it. Thank you very much for your time. And I think it's probably drinks now, is it, Tony? You've got some closing remarks to make?
Thank you, Rachel. That was excellent. Now, and we do have time for a couple of short questions. If you wish to say some questions now, then please announce who you would like to answer your questions and talk to me, and then I'll invite the speakers up the podium. For anyone watching online, if you wish to ask questions, unfortunately, you need to send an email through to one of us and we will respond in due course. So, any questions? Yes?
You all, without exception, have said it's not a question of if but when. Why?
If but when we'll come back to China. Oh, I think that the market will reopen at some stage. Political tensions come and go. I think this will last for some time. So this is not something that will be resolved in the next 2 to 3 years, but it will be resolved in the 5 to 10 year mark. I'm very confident that once the broader geopolitical concerns are resolved, that we will see Australia, who's been caught in the middle, that will resolve that. We've had a very good relationship with China for many years. We've had a good technical relationship. We continue to have that technical relationship, certainly in multilateral and plurilateral forums. So I think we'll be back, absolutely, but not in the next 5 years. Yes?
Thank you. Is there any subsidies program could be applied or put in forward for the wineries or winemakers, and to move forward, or at least to stay for the difficulty times?
So there will be a number of programs that we can provide to help exporters. So Rachel alluded to what I would suggest, and most of the state governments are also looking at programs that will assist exports to diversify markets. Australian Grape and Wine will also look at programs. They're not subsidy programs, but there will be programs that will help people find those markets and get into those markets. So it's really a good idea to have a chat to Rachel a bit later, and to Damien, and also to representatives from the state governments who are always doing their bit. So there will be, certainly, we're looking at a number of opportunities. We don't have subsidies per se, but certainly there will be programs available that will help people.
To add to that, Ali Lockwood from State Government, there is a subsidy at the moment for the market entry program into the US. So state government's funding 50% for up to 15 spots for companies to go into the market entry program. So that's open for another 6 weeks. The other point to note is that the Premier announced a $5.4 million grant over 4 years to support South Australian producers to diversify markets. That's very much based around retail campaigns across the established markets, growing new markets, and developing capability as well too with exporters for new markets and new channels. I just did have one question, Damien. The tiered markets are different to what Austrade and Wine Australia have advocated.
You can do it from here. Yeah, they possibly are. They're not set in stone. As I sort of alluded to, there's a whole range of different company, state, and national priorities. I wouldn't take those markets as being the be-all and end-all. Those are just a sort of it's a summary of how those tiers are being considered in terms of the national approach to all of this. So, you know, that tier 1 is fairly well consistent, the tier 2 similarly, and within that third tier, it varies from depending on who the particular party is in terms of what the priority would be. One of the things we will be doing as part of our work is trying to better coordinate what those priorities will be across all interests. So whether that's business, state, region, or nationally across all of the things that we're working on. So.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. And I think one of the critical things is that there's a lot of money being spent in various states, regions and nationally. We want to make sure it is synergistic and it's not duplicative. And that's one of the concerns that we are working very closely together. So there's slightly different priority markets that West Australia have, that South Australia have, that Australian Grape and Wine, our members have identified. But overall, what we're doing is making sure there's no duplication and that we're working together collaboratively.
Hi. Thanks for the great presentation today. Actually, I think it was about this time 3 years ago, we were in this room talking about getting businesses ready to go to Hong Kong for the Ving Expo. So it's interesting to see how quickly things changed in less than 3 years. My question is actually very much based on what Ali was saying earlier about the tiered system, and Damien was touching on that. And Rachel, I think you mentioned all the marketing asset that was created under the $50 million package. So my question really is about the brand messaging. Are we looking at creating different brand stories, different narratives for each of these tiers, or perhaps markets like India or Indonesia? We're looking at maybe creating a different set of marketing message for each of the market, given the huge differences in each of those markets? Or are we looking at just using sort of the same kind of content that we've already built going to these new emerging markets? I know this is probably a difficult question, but just want to understand a little bit about the thought process behind it.
No, certainly the thinking is that the assets we've developed are ones that we can use in all the markets. Some of the strategies we'll do in the markets will be different. So, you know, we might look for retail activations and consumer-facing activities within a market like South Korea, for example, or Japan. But certainly those assets that we've developed, we believe are consistent across most of the markets. So we think we can use those. So I think the 50 million, the legacy of the 50 million in those assets is going to be very strong and a very important part of the program. And that's certainly how we've identified it.
Can I just add to that? I absolutely agree with what Tony says, but, you know, of course things evolve over time. And, you know, just last week I was lucky enough to see some old promotional material from the Australian Wine Board back in the sort of mid-50s. And, you know, never does it become so evident that, you know, the way that we promote wine has evolved enormously, and it will continue to evolve. And of course, there will be different nuances in different markets. So, you know, it's not as though we've developed these assets and they're just going to be stagnant. Now we will absolutely look to adapt them as need be, but we've got a pretty good starting point, you know, already with the assets that have been developed.
Thanks, Rachel. If there's no further questions, I'd just like to thank all the listeners in the room. I would like to thank everyone online who's been watching, and there are quite a number of people who registered for this, and all the speakers, of course. So you mentioned the 50s, Rachel, that's when Steve started, of course. So
I was going to note that the export controls that started in 1930s, just before Steve started in the industry.
So, for all the speakers, I would like, you must excuse our sides, but I would like to thank all the speakers. I thought they were very insightful. Please, everyone here, stay for a drink. Grab hold of anyone to have a chat with. If we can't answer your question, we'll come back to you later. And for those online, just send us an email and we'll get back to you as well. So thank you very much, and we'll close the session now.